Good afternoon. I'm Tom Carruthers of the Carnegie Endowment. I'll be moderating this next session, which is on emerging political forces, and in particular political parties, but of course other political forces as well. As I think pretty much everybody knows, political parties are not popular in most parts of the world. If you travel to almost anywhere in the developing world or former communist world and even many Western democracies, political parties are among the least popular, respected political institutions that exist. And the complaints that people have about political parties tend to sound the same almost anywhere you go. Political parties are seen as being vehicles for strong leaders who don't really care about the rest of the organization. They're seen as being self-interested organizations that only serve their own interests. They're seen as having incoherent programs or ideologies that are just sort of words but no real action. They're seen as organizations that wake up around the time of elections but then go to sleep afterwards, and so forth. So when political change hit hard the Arab world 3 years ago, and there was suddenly the chance for much more pluralism and activity by political parties, it was predictable and has happened that Arab publics would find themselves quite dissatisfied with both the array of choices they had and the organizations there to try to represent them. And although their grievances are real and they're serious and need to be addressed, at the same time they're not very surprising. And we have to take that as another part of transitions that is to be expected, difficult though it is. And what we have in Egypt, as well as some of the other countries that have opened up politically to some extent, of course, is some older parties that existed in the authoritarian or semi-authoritarian period, and as well as new parties or new groupings, alliances, coalitions, and movements. The old parties are slow to change. They're often fossilized in different ways. The new parties are usually fragile and inexperienced. And so in some ways, you often have the worst of both worlds. You have old parties that don't seem to be able to change and new parties that don't seem to be able to become effective actors. And that, of course, has many consequences. So we're going to talk about some of those issues. And we'll take a bit, I think, a general perspective of the region as a whole, because Marwan Mouasher's book is in many ways about pluralism and political engagement, and he has been thinking about that widely. Then we also have Fareed Zahran from the Egyptian Social Democratic Party, which is one of the components of the Egyptian political scene that is striving for political representation in the new environment. Marwan, would you like to go first, or Fareed?
Sure. I'll be short, because we have a practitioner among us that I think would all be interested in hearing from. Everything that Tom said, of course, I think is happening in the Arab world. We're witnessing the same phenomenon that other political parties across the world have seen. Most parties are still elitist, without any clear programs, centered around elections, centered around personalities, not able to raise funds effectively, not able to mobilize and have clear programs on the ground. All of this is certainly happening in the Arab world. I think there's a vacuum today in the Arab world brought about by the failure of the two main, if you want, ideological forces in the region for the last 100 years. A number of political parties have had secular ideologies, the Ba'ath, for example, even the nationalist parties who have made a name for themselves in fighting colonialism and working for independence. These were issues that galvanized people around them. And of course, the Islamists used religion to galvanize people around them as well. When secular parties basically failed to produce stable and prosperous societies, that failure being, I think, exhibited most prominently after 1967 and the failure to liberate Palestine, because that was a common theme among many of them. People tended, or many tended, to drift towards Islam, not always because they agreed with the ideology, but because it was a protest vote against the failure of secular forces. Today in the Arab world, we're seeing, sort of the failure of both parties to provide, or ideologies to provide common or problems to everyday life. I think we've heard from Mustafa about what the Islamists are doing in Morocco. Interestingly, Mustafa calls it a third path. So it's a third path that sort of is emerging out of an established ideological party, but this time with the aim of addressing people's problems. And I think emerging parties in the in the Arab world are finding this to be a very huge challenge. How do you galvanize people around you? How do you deliver on economic issues in a transition where delivery is not going to be immediate and quick? And so far, most of them are not succeeding. Finance, fundraising is going to be an extremely important issue in big countries like Egypt. It's a poor country. How do you raise funds? And I think Farid might be able to tell us about his own party and experience in raising funds. How do you not just talk about liberal values? If you are a secular, new party, how do you just, peaceful rotation of power and human rights and judicial independence are all noble objectives, but they don't necessarily, to the average citizen, they don't bring bread. So how do you really turn these ideals into practical programs that the average citizen can identify with is still a huge challenge in the Arab world. In my view, both established orders, if you will, the old guard in the Arab world, the secular people, both those in power and those attempting to establish themselves, as well as the Islamists in most Arab countries, are behaving in a zero-sum game. They are behaving in a winner-take-all strategy. This is now my personal view. We've heard Wa'el this morning. There is no willingness to accept any sort of shortcomings. There's no willingness to work with the other party. But I think in the same way that Islamists have shown a majoritarian trend in the Arab world, secular parties, at least in countries like Egypt, are also behaving in a majoritarian way and in an exclusionist manner. And so far, very few, if any, frankly, are working towards putting in place the institutional foundation for pluralistic societies in which political, cultural, and religious diversity is respected at all times. It's a long way from here, and I'm not sure that any political party has even set itself on a track towards these objectives. So this is just what I wanted to say in general, and I want to give the floor to Farid, who will give us the experience of one such emerging political party in Egypt, the Social Democratic Party. Farid.
في الحقيقة أنا عايز أبدأ كلامي بالإشارة إلى أنه التقسيم للحياة السياسية المصرية. تترجم ولا أسيب لك وقت ولا أعمل إيه؟
بقول لك أنا لما أصير
وقفني.
أيوه.
الحياة السياسية المصرية جرى تقسيمها إلى 4 تيارات أساسية: ليبرالية ويسارية وناصرية قومية وإسلامية. كان هذا هو التقسيم السائد منذ الحرب العالمية الثانية وحتى 25 يناير. بعد 25 يناير ظهرت تقسيمات جديدة فرضها الوضع على الأرض. شفنا بقى التقسيم لديني مدني وفقا للموقف من هوية الدولة. شفنا تقسيمات إلى قوى ديمقراطية وقوى غير ديمقراطية وفقا للموقف من قضية الديمقراطية. يعني بدأت تبقى فيه تقسيمات أخرى. أنا مش هتطرق بالتفصيل إلى هذا الموضوع، هو موجود في الورقة ممكن تقروها على مهلكم. لكن عايز أقول إن بعد 25 يناير التقسيم اللي أنا معتمده، لأن في تقسيمات اعتمدت لفرض آراء معينة، زي مثلا دلوقتي في تقسيم بيقول إن الحياة السياسية تنقسم إلى إخوان وخصوم للإخوان. طب افرض في حد ثالث مش كده بالظبط، ممكن اعتبره طابور خامس. اعداء الاخوان هيشوفوا ان هو عميل للاخوان، والاخوان هيشوفوه عميل لاعداء الاخوان، وبالتالي تظل الحياه السياسيه المصريه رهينه الاستقطاب الى اخوان وخصوم للاخوان. انا بفترض ان هناك تقسيم اخر للحياه السياسيه المصريه الى 3 قوى رئيسيه من 25 يناير: قوى تسعى لاقامه دوله دينيه، وقوة تسعى لإقامة دولة ديمقراطية، وقوة تسعى لعودة النظام القديم يعني بتركيبة ما أو بأخرى، ولكن هي في النهاية أنا بسميها قوة الدولة القديمة. 3 اتجاهات دول هتقول؟
I think بعد هيك بس. So in Egyptian political life, until the Arab uprisings of 2011, forces could be divided into 4 main strands: liberal, leftist, Nasserist, and pan-Arabist. After January 25th, people started looking at these forces in terms of new divisions: secular, religious, or democratic, anti-democratic. There is a tendency today in Egypt to lump everybody into only one of 2 forces, either pro-Ikhwan, pro-brotherhood, or anti-brotherhood. And that, of course, leaves no space for any third political parties. Farid would like to categorize the forces in Egypt today in terms of 3 main categories: those that are working for a religious state, those that are working for a civil democratic state, and those who want the old state, the old guard, to come back.
والإشارة إن المساحة اللي متروكة في التقسيم الثنائي هي للطابور الخامس، هي للخونة والجواسيس اللي هم احنا يعني.
And in this simplistic division of pro-Ikhwan and anti-Ikhwan, any third force is seen as a 5th column in Egypt.
هذا التقسيم للوضع السياسي الآن يعني يفرض تحديات محددة على القوى الديمقراطية ويطرح عليها صعوبات محددة. أنا يعني مش عايز أخذلك، ولكن عايز أقول إن آخر ما نفكر فيه في الحزب المصري الديمقراطي الاجتماعي هو مشكلة التمويل مثلا، رغم أنها مشكلة مهمة ونحن لسنا حزب غني، ولكن هذه قضايا يمكن حلها، واختبرنا نفسنا على مدى 3 سنوات أو 2.5 سنين وحلينا هذه المشكلات الحقيقة والتحديات اللي بتواجه القوى الديمقراطية إذا كانت راغبة فعلا في الوصول إلى السلطة، وهذا أمر وارد ومحتمل وممكن. هي بالتحديد أولا مدى تماسك القوى الديمقراطية نفسها، مدى تمسك القوى الديمقراطية بمشروعها الديمقراطي. هناك مشكلة في هذا الموضوع. لماذا؟ لأنه خلينا نعود قليلا وراء. القوى الديمقراطية المقصود بها الليبراليين واليساريين والناصريين القوميين والديمقراطيين الاجتماعيين، اللي هي قوة أنا بعتبرها قوة جديدة ما بعد 25 يناير تبلورت. ال4 اتجاهات بيشكلوا في مجملهم دعاة الدولة المدنية الديمقراطية الحديثة. هم ليسوا على قلب رجل واحد. أخطر ما هناك ليس خلافاتهم بخصوص برنامج الاجتماعي مثلا، هذا أمر يمكن التفاهم بخصوصه. أخطر ما هنالك أن بعض القوى مثلا الليبرالية تخشى أن يؤدي المشروع الديمقراطي إلى موجب الاحتجاجات العمالية المطلبية، وبالتالي إلى فقد جزء من أرباحها وامتيازاتها. فهذه القوى الليبرالية لا تتحمس كثيرا للمشروع الديمقراطي لأنه قد يعني يهدد بعض مصالحها. القوى القومية الناصرية اعتادت أن تحلم بمستبد عادل، اعتادت أن تحلم بإعادة استنساخ عبد الناصر، وبالتالي لما تكون قوى الدولة القديمة بتحاول تخلق من السيسي عبد الناصر جديد، كثير من القوى القومية والناصرية يعني يغازلها هذه الفكرة، يشد انتباهها هذه الفكرة فتنصرف عن التمسك بالمشروع الديمقراطي. المشروع الديمقراطي إذن يعني مهدد من داخله، لأنه مش كل مكوناته وتياراته يعني متمسكة بالمشروع نفسه. كفاية.
Farid says that the principal challenge that he sees is not the issue of financing. He says these are issues that can be resolved. What he sees as the principal challenge is whether the democratic forces or those that potentially can work for democracy, whether they can stay cohesive. He sees potentially forces that can work for democracy as the liberals, the leftists, the Nasserists, the Pan-Arabists, and a new force, the Social Democrats, of which he is a member.
احنا والدستور والعدل، يعني في 3 أحزاب كانوا بيتمسكوا بالديمقراطية الاجتماعية. هذه ظاهرة جديدة.
So again, the Constitution Party, Baradei's party, and Al-Adl, Justice Party, and the Social Democrats. But he fears that the democratic project might be threatened from within, because all of these forces do not have a common understanding of democracy. The liberals, for example, do not want democracy to lead to labor protests and therefore to demands that run against their thinking. The Nasserists would like a Nasser-like type regime, and therefore the issue of Sisi is one that might be appealing to such forces at the expense of democracy. So that Farid says as the main threat to the to a democratic discourse in Egypt, in that the forces that are that might be willing to work for democracy do not have a common understanding and might not stay together.
المشكلة الثانية هي ان الناس تعبت جدا. 3 سنوات مفيش انجاز على الارض، مفيش حل للمشكلات الكبيرة اللي مطروحة، وفي كلام طول الوقت، في كلام، والكلام يعني اصبح شبه اي كلام، واصبحت كل اللعبة السياسية موضع نقد او استهجان او قرف من عدد كبير جدا من المواطنين. هذه المشاعر بدأت منذ فترة. انا اذكر انه في الاستفتاء على دستور الاخوان في 2012 نزلت في فندق بعد الاستفتاء، فلقيت العاملين في الفندق في قطاع السياحة اللي هو اكتر قطاع يعني كان يفترض ان هو ضد الاخوان وحكم الاخوان ودستور الاخوان. فسألت بعض العاملين يعني انتوا رحتوا الاستفتاء؟ قالوا لي عملتوا ايه؟ قالوا لي قلنا نعم. طب واحد منهم وهو بيتكلم عرفت انه مسيحي كمان. فيعني بقى صدمت، يعني مسيحيين ومشتغلين في قطاع السياحه وراحوا صوتوا بنعم لدستور الاخوان. قلت لهم انتوا بتحبوا الاخوان؟ قالوا لا طبعا، بكرههم كره العامه وبتاع، وقعدوا يشتموا. طب قلتوا نعم ليه؟ قالوا احنا قلنا نعم للاستقرار عشان نخلص، لانه لا شكلها مجهول، شكلها غامض، شكلها غير واضح. طيب الناس تعبت جدا، وفي نفس الوقت وهنا بقى الصعوبة التانية اللي مطروحة على المشروع الديمقراطي. المشروع الديمقراطي بالأمانة وبما يرضي الله غامض، غير واضح إلى حد ما، مش واضح يعني خطوطه الرئيسية. الحديث عن الديمقراطية والحرية والكلام وبتاع ده يعني بالبلدي كده ما بياكلش مع الناس. ايه اللي يغيب عن المشروع الديمقراطي لكي يكون يعني متماسك وقادر انه يكون له خطاب اجتماعي؟ المشروع الديمقراطي لم يقدم بعد خطاب اجتماعي. انا بقول المشروع الديمقراطي مش الحزب. يعني ممكن يبقى الحزب المصري الديمقراطي الاجتماعي مثلا ناجح في انه يقدم خطاب اجتماعي في وسط الاماكن اللي هو موجود فيها ووسط جمهوره وكده، لكن المشروع الديمقراطي مش مشروع متكامل. يعني تصوره الاقتصادي الاجتماعي ناقص بشكل فادح، ودي أنا في رأيي التحدي الآخر المهم والصعوبة التانية اللي بتواجه هذا المشروع في إقناع الناس والجمهور هي استكمال هذا المشروع الديمقراطي بخطاب اجتماعي واضح. هتقول
Second challenge is that people are exhausted. People are fed up with the process. It has not brought about stability or prosperity. Farid talks about some people last year, even Christians, voting for the constitution that the Muslim Brotherhood developed only because they wanted stability, not necessarily because they agreed with what the constitution had to say. He also sees that this is a point that I alluded to also before, that the liberal or the democratic discourse so far is not clear. I mean, people don't want necessarily or don't subscribe just to people telling them about liberal values and peaceful rotation and human rights and all. They need, bread and butter issues, and that unless any democratic force combines talk about democracy with a clear social program, it will not resonate with a lot of people.
التحدي الثالث أو المشكلة الثالثة من وجهة نظري هي مدى قوة القوى الديمقراطية. مدى قوة القوى الديمقراطية في هذا الصدد هناك أمرين. الأمر الأول هو إيه قوة القوى الديمقراطية على الأرض، والأمر الثاني إيه قوة القوى الديمقراطية في الفضاء، لأن أنا رأيي أن الفضاء لا يقل أهمية عن الأرض. أنا أقول أن أنا أقصده بالفضاء يعني القوى الديمقراطية أولا على الأرض كبيرة وبتنمو بمعدلات سريعة جدا. يعني أنا أذكر جيدا عقب الانتخابات البرلمانية السابقة الوافدين الجدد على العمل السياسي أو الهواة أو الذين ظهروا للعمل السياسي مع الثورة صدموا من الحجم الأصوات التي حصل عليها الإخوان. لم يصدمني أنا هذا الأمر، بالعكس أنا صدمني المقاعد التي حصل عليها الحزب المصري الديمقراطي الاجتماعي. نحن كان عمرنا بضعة شهور، كان عندنا مقر واحد، خدنا 20 كرسي في البرلمان وأصبحنا القوى الرابعة في برلمان يعني جاء في ظروف شديدة الصعوبة. كنا رجل في الميدان في محمد محمود والقصر العيني والمظاهرات، ورجل في الانتخابات، والإخوان منظمين ويعني وفي ذروة قوتهم، وإحنا كان عندنا مقر واحد في القاهرة وكنا حزب بقاله 3 شهور أو 4 شهور، ومع ذلك أصبحنا القوى الرابعة في البرلمان. إذن الخطاب الديمقراطي وعود القوى الديمقراطية ممكنة في العمل على الأرض. طبعا أنا بتكلم ده في الانتخابات البرلمانية. أنا عايز أقول لكم أن أنا في الحملة الخاصة بدعم الدستور اللي عملها الحزب عملنا حوالي 25 مؤتمر، منهم مش أقل من 5 أو 6 مؤتمرات كانوا في قرى. وعشان أعمل مؤتمر في قرية معناه أن ليا وجود يستطيع أن يحمي مؤتمر في الظروف الأمنية الراهنة. الأمن ما كانش بيوافق على مؤتمراتنا، كان بيقول لنا مش هنقدرش نوفر لكم حماية. كنا احنا بنحمي مؤتمراتنا وبننزل. احنا موجودين على الأرض، احنا مش موجودين على الأرض زي الإخوان مثلا يعني اللي هم حزب بقاله 80، بس احنا موجودين على الأرض. ده أولا. ثانيا احنا موجودين في الفضاء، بمعنى وأنا كنت بقول للإخوان الكلام ده كثيرا ما كانوش بيسمعوه، وبقولوا اليومين دول للفلول ولأنصار الدولة الأمنية وأنصار نظام مبارك إن احنا إذا كنا على الأرض 10% فاحنا في الثقافة 50%، وإذا كنا على الأرض 10% فاحنا في الإعلام 60%، وإذا كنا على الأرض 10% فاحنا تأثيرنا على الرأي العام وقدرتنا في التأثير على الرأي العام تزيد عن 60 و70%. احنا موجودين في الفضاء الثقافي والإعلامي، احنا موجودين في عقل الشعب المصري وفي وجدانه أكتر من أي قوة أخرى. احنا اللي مننا الفنانين والأدباء والموسيقيين والعاملين في النشاط الإعلامي. القوى الديمقراطية وجودها قوي جدا في هذه المجالات، هذا لم يفهمه الإخوان على الإطلاق ولم يفهمه الفلول على الإطلاق. فإحنا قوة اللي موجودة قوة كبيرة. إيه المشكلة بقى؟ يعني إذا كنا موجودين على الأرض وإذا كنا موجودين في الفضاء، المشكلة أن هذه القوة لا تعي قوتها، وبالتالي وده التحدي الثالث اللي بنواجهه، هذه القوة لا تفاوض بشكل جيد، هذه القوة تقدم تنازلات ليست ضرورية، هذه القوة تقدم تنازلات قبل بدء المفاوضات. وأنا أشير هنا إلى الأسابيع الماضية وإلى الأسابيع القادمة. القوى الديمقراطية تستطيع أن تحرز انتصارات كبرى إذا دخلت مفاوضات تعي فيها قوتها. هذا هو التحدي الثالث من الآخر.
The third challenge is that these democratic forces don't really don't know what its real power on the ground and in space is. These forces are present in the ground, on the ground, and that presence is actually growing dramatically. Farid lists his own party as an example. It is a party that has only emerged after the transition in Egypt, and despite only few months of campaigning, have won 20 seats in parliament, establishing themselves as the fourth power after the Ikhwan, Hizb al-Nur, and the Wafd party. So he says that it is not true that democratic forces cannot have an influence. They do have an influence on the ground, and it is growing. They also are more influential in space, what he calls space, meaning on the waves. 50%, he says, of in culture, in media, in democratic forces' power to influence public opinion is not only great, but it is actually greater than they give themselves credit for, and therefore they underestimate their real power, and in negotiations with other forces they tend to submit unnecessary compromises because they don't understand or appreciate their real power.
يعني أنا هضرب مثال واضح لحجم القوى الديمقراطية وقوتها. احنا في 30/6 أنا كنت بلاحظ لما بننزل مؤتمرات أو مسيرات ضد الإخوان أن في بعض المحافظات اللي ملناش فيها وجود الفلول أو قوى الدولة القديمة أقوى كثيرا كانوا بيتراجعوا إلى خلفية المشهد ويصروا على أن نتقدم نحن إلى صدارة المشهد، يعني بطريقة وكأن هناك اتفاق أو وكأن هناك تعليمات. حقيقة الأمر أن هم كانوا يروا في أنفسهم وجوه محروقة غير قادرة على التصدي للقيادة. وجودها في صدارة المشهد سيسبب مشاكل مع الجمهور ويخلي الناس تنصرف عنها، وبالتالي كانوا حريصين على أن نتصدر نحن المشهد. بعد 30/6 وإسقاط نظام الإخوان بدأ بعض الفلول ورجال الدولة القديمة يعتبروا ان احنا انجزنا المهمة فعلينا اذن ان ننصرف، يعني خلاص بقى القوى الديمقراطية تروح او يتقبض عليها او تروح السجن اي حاجة يعني. لما جت معركة الدستور حاولت القوى القديمة ان تطل برأسها مرة اخرى، فظهرت قيادات الدولة القديمة علشان تبيع الدستور للناس، فصدم الرأي العام وتراجعت الدولة فورا وسحبت هذه الوجوه القديمة المحروقة، وتصدر المشهد مرة أخرى القوى الديمقراطية والعناصر الديمقراطية لتسويق هذا الدستور واللي هم كانوا موافقين عليه طبعا. وبالتالي قوى الدولة القديمة مهما كانت قوتها على الأرض بالذات في الأقاليم والقرى والأحياء الشعبية والأحياء العشوائية والمدن الصغيرة، فهي في النهاية يعني لا يمكن أن تستطيع قيادة الرأي العام في اللحظة الراهنة، لأنها أغلبها وجوه محروقة ومرفوضة شعبيا من الناس. ومن يدرك الأمر يدرك هذا. ولسه كنا بنتكلم في اليومين الثلاثة اللي فاتوا فقط أنه عدم ذهاب الشباب إلى صناديق الاقتراع سبب ذعر لأجهزة الدولة في مصر، وبدأت في عقد سلسلة مكثفة من الاجتماعات مع شباب الأحزاب والقوى السياسية. وأنا كنت بتابع امبارح وأول امبارح الاجتماعات ديت، يعني وزير الداخلية كان يعتذر في هذه الاجتماعات عن ما سببه للشباب أو ما يمكن أن يكون قد لحق به من أذى. وإحنا في الظروف في الأيام دي بالتحديد أفرج عن زميلنا حسام حسن عضو الهيئة العليا في الحزب وشاب من أسيوط، كان نزل في المظاهرات الاحتجاجية على قانون التظاهر وتنوا في السجن لغاية ما خرجش إلا من بعد الاستفتاء، يعني في هذه الأجواء يعني. إذن القوى الديمقراطية يعني أنا نسيت اقول برضو حاجه مهمه في قوه القوى الديمقراطيه، كلام اللي اشار له حسام في مداخلته، ائتلاف شباب كومومبو وتحالف ثوار امبابه والحاجات الغريبه اللي موجوده على الارض دي ما ماتتش. دي بتحصل لها عمليه اب اند داون كده كل فتره. يعني دي ممكن تبقى منصرفه الان احباطا قرفا زهقا، لكن في النهايه موجوده على الارض. والقوى التي تمثل هؤلاء الشباب في التحليل الأخير هي القوى الديمقراطية. صحيح الشباب دول في كثير من الأحيان بيهاجموا القوى الديمقراطية ورموزها، وأحيانا يتهموننا بالخيانة والعمالة وبيع القضية وكل الكلام ده بيحصل، بس وقت الجد وقت المعارك القوى الديمقراطية هي التي تمثل هذه الائتلافات والمجموعات الشبابية.
Again, talking about the strength of democratic forces, when there were demonstrations before June 30, particularly in areas where democratic forces were not strong, the old guard forces, al-Fulul, would step back because they know they do not have credibility with the public, and would allow the democratic forces to be at the forefront of these demonstrations. After June 30, some of the old guard started thinking that the democratic forces did the job and has to now basically leave the scene to the old guard forces. And as such, it tried to promote the new constitution to the public, but did not succeed at doing that. And once again left the promotion to the democratic forces because they have more credibility. Another point is that the youth movements, many of the youth movements, yes, are frustrated, but are still on the ground. And in the end, even though they criticize democratic forces, in the end, when there is when there is a battle to be fought, then there is no other forces but these democratic forces to represent most of these youth movements.
طيب فاضل نقول انه فاضل نقطتين. نقطة خاصة وثيقة الصلة بالنقطة السابقة هي نقص الخبرات التنظيمية والسياسية. القوى الديمقراطية حصل لها تضخم وانفجار هائل، لأنه أنا مثلا في الحزب المصري الديمقراطي الاجتماعي لو كان الحزب مثلا فيه 20-30 ألف عضو نشيط، فمن 20-30 ألف دول في 200-300 ليهم علاقة بالسياسة قبل الثورة، والباقي عناصر جديدة. هذا أمر حسن جدا وإيجابي جدا، ولكنه أمر صعب جدا مرعب يخوف، يعني لأنه في النهاية كل هذه الجيوش، يعني أنا بنزل محافظات أقابل مئات الناس وآلاف الناس أحيانا ما لهمش أي علاقة بالسياسة، ما عندهمش أي خبرات سياسية، ما قروش في حياتهم كتاب، ممكن يبقوا قبل ثورة 25 يناير ما كانوش يعرفوا يعني دستور، ما كانوش بيقروا جورنال، يعني ناس بسيطة جدا يملأها الحماس وشاركت في الثورة أو ما بعد الثورة حتى، وكل هؤلاء الناس يعني لا يملكوا إلا حماسهم. وفي النهاية الناس دي يعني في مواقع قيادية في الأحزاب، يعني احنا عندنا في الحزب نسبة كبيرة من القيادة من هؤلاء الناس، لأنه هو ده الحزب، يعني في 200-300 على مستوى قومي كان لهم علاقة بالسياسة أو يعرفوا بعض قبل الثورة، وعشرات الألوف بقى ما يعرفوش بعض وما لهمش أي خبرات سياسية. بعض هؤلاء الناس في الهيئة العليا، مش بعض، أغلبية الهيئة العليا في الحزب من هؤلاء الناس، نسبة الغالبة في المكتب السياسي من هؤلاء الناس، نسبة أقل طبعا في المكتب التنفيذي اللي هو الدائرة الأضيق من هؤلاء الناس. هذا يؤثر كثيرا على ممارسات ومواقف الحزب، تأثيرات سلبية، لأنه في النهاية نقص الخبرات والسياسية والتنظيمية بيسبب ارتباك. يعني جزء منه اللي أنا كنت بأشير إليه من شوية اللي هو عدم القدرة على المفاوضة، عدم القدرة على انتزاع حقوق، يعني انت تبقى في مفاوضات مع قوى الدولة القديمة او في مفاوضات مع الاخوان، ومن الممكن ان تحرز مكاسب في فترة سابقة، يعني المفاوضات مع الاخوان، وما تقدرش تحرز مكاسب لانه قدرتك على المفاوضة وكذا مش قد كده. برضو نقص الخبرات التنظيمية والسياسية معناه مدى تماسك الحزب. لأي حد الحزب متماسك سياسيا وتنظيميا بالاستناد على هذا العدد المحدود من الخبرات. يعني هذا العدد المحدود من الخبرات عليه انه يقوم بادوار تثقيفيه، وعليه انه يقوم بادوار سياسيه، وعليه انه يقوم بادوار تنظيميه، وعليه احيانا يقوم بادوار اداريه، وعليه انه يقوم بادوار الخطابه وعقد المؤتمرات. يعني عدد محدود واعباء كبيره، وفي النهايه ده بيخلي الحزب احيانا اداؤه مترهل، مش متناغم بما يكفي، مش قادر يبقى في اتجاه واحد بما يكفي، الى اخره. حتى درجه الانسجام داخله ووحده الموقف السياسي بتبقى مش واضحه بما يكفي. انا اقول النقطه الاخيره كمان، لانك بصيت في الساعه. النقطه الاخيره وربما تكون اهم نقطه وكان ممكن ابدا بيها، اللي هي موقف الجيش. بدون الحديث عن موقف الجيش يصبح اي حديث عن امكانيات القوى الديمقراطيه ومستقبلها حديث يعني منقوص. موقف الجيش مننا، لا، انا اعني ما اقول. موقف الجيش من المشروعات المختلفه. هناك مشروعات تطرحها الدوله القديمه، انا بقول عليهم 3 مشروعات. الدوله القديمه تطرح مشروع المستبد العادل، والدوله القديمه تطرح مشروع الدوله الامنيه اللي هو لا صوت يعلو فوق صوت المعركه والاجهزه الامنيه تشتغل، والدوله القديمه تطرح المشروع الثالث اللي انا بسميه الاصلاح الاداري او مشروع جمال مبارك. 3 مشروعات للدوله القديمه تتصارع فيما بينها وتختلف وتتفق، لكن في النهايه هم 3. وفي مشروع الاخوان، وده مشروع الجيش اعلن موقفه منه، الجيش رفضه. وفي مشروع القوى الديمقراطيه، وانا في تقديري ان الجيش حتى الان عكس ما ناس كثيره تتصور، الجيش لم ينحاز بعد الى اي من المشروعات المطروحه. الجيش في حاله تفكير متردد، الجيش في ازمه كبيره، لانه الغلطه بجون زي ما بيقولوا بالبلدي. يعني الجيش ليس مسموحا له ان يخطئ، لان الخطا اللي يرتكبه هيكون المره دي يعني الجيش اللي بيرتكبه، يعني وبالتالي هيضع الامور في موقف صعب جدا، يخلي الشعب في مواجهه الجيش، وده امر في منتهى الخطوره. فالجيش يعني طيب قول.
مش الفينش.
اذا بتخلص
انا بخلص بس الحته دي. انا عايز اقول مش موقفنا من الجيش الحاسم، موقف الجيش مننا. لو الجيش منحاز للمشروع الديمقراطي ده هيدي دفعه قويه جدا للمشروع الديمقراطي. لو الجيش هيقف حتى على الحياد ده هيعطي دفعه للمشروع الديمقراطي. لكن لو الجيش انحاز بكل ما يعنيه الجيش من شعبيه السيسي، السيسي له شعبيه جارفه غير مسبوقه في تاريخ مصر الحديث. لو السيسي انحاز في التوقيت ده الى دوله مبارك او الدوله الامنيه باي من مشروعاتها، يبقى المشروع الديمقراطي هيتضرب يعني ضربه كبيره في مقتل يعني. بس انا خلصت.
شكرا جزيلا. So I guess the fourth challenge is the lack of political and organizational abilities for these new emerging political parties. As an example, well, he says out of maybe 20,000 members of his party, only 300 really know anything about politics. The rest do not, and the problem is that many of them are in leading positions in the party, and therefore their lack of training, their lack of is a problem for the positions and the practices of the party. And because of this also, it means that the party itself might not be very cohesive at times, with a very limited set and number of skilled people in it. The most important point in Farid's view, and of course he's talking about Egypt here, is the position of the army vis-a-vis all these forces. Farid says that the Fulul, the old guard, wants a benevolent dictator, or put forward the model of a benevolent dictator, of a security state, and of administrative reform, but not necessarily political reform, that Jamal Mubarak was advocating. of course, then you have the Muslim Brotherhood project, which has been rejected by the army. The Democratic Forces project, it is not yet clear what the army's position vis-a-vis this is. Sisi today is an extremely popular man in Egypt. Were Sisi to stand behind the Democratic Forces, he would or leave them alone. It would go a long way towards the development and strengthening of these forces. If he were to stand by the old guards project, it would have catastrophic results on these forces. And I think we should do that.
Yeah, we should probably just a little bit of time for some comments or discussion. You feel free to just make a comment if you'd like, in perspective from your own experience or country that you're close to, or you can do it as questions for Marwan or Farid. Yes, who'd like to just come in? We'll just have a little bit of time. Steve.
Just quickly, it's interesting because, and it's not surprising, that the impression you present, which was quite interesting, is also enormously contradictory. There are just pressures pushing in all kinds of different directions. You talked about the failure of democratic parties to provide a vision that would compel support from the Egyptian public. And yet, on the other hand, it seems as if the democratic principles and values that these parties might articulate resonates with the Egyptian public at a certain level. The parties have failed to build popular organizations. They've failed to generate support. They haven't been able to demonstrate their ability to operate effectively, and yet no other parties have operated effectively. I mean, show me which political actors in Egypt have actually delivered on the expectations and demands of Egyptian citizens. So in some ways, it's a weak political field, and the puzzle about why these emerging parties have not been able to perform even better, if in fact there is public support for some of the perspectives they express, is all the more puzzling. So there are these two contradictory images of these parties as weak, out of touch, and of these parties as expressing views that are strongly held, but maybe doing it ineffectively. I mean, how do you? I'm trying to sort of build perhaps too much of a coherent narrative out of this very conflicted political arena.
Let me take thank you, Steve, a couple of the comments or questions before we have the final. Yes, please.
Arabic or English?
Well, as long as Marwan proves to be an excellent translator.
قول بالانجلش. ما دام السؤال هي لازم تترجم.
يا ترى بس حبيت اعرف شو يكون ردك اللي يقولون انه التجربه بمصر اخر كم سنه وخاصه بعد اسقاط نظام الاخوان انه اثبت نوعا ما انه ما تسميه انت القوه الديمقراطيه بتناقض جذري، لانه يعني رغم التسميه قوه ديمقراطيه اكو حس اقصائي وحس غير ديمقراطي بالقوه الديمقراطيه هاي. فيعني
اقصائي زي مين؟
يعني رده الفعل بعد اسقاط نظام اخوان المسلمين.
احنا اللي اسقطناه، يعني انا ما زعلتش لانه اسقط، انا مساهم في اسقاطه، انا مساهم في اسقاطه بنفسي. ساعات اقول لك انا عملت ايه، يعني هم عارفين انا عملت ايه عشان اسقطه، فانا ما عنديش اي احساس بالذنب اذا اسقاطه.
بس
فخور
بس يعني السؤال هو ردك للتهمون.
انا شاركت في اسقاط نظام مبارك وشاركت في اسقاط نظام مرسي بكل فخر.
بس يسأل
السؤال هو اللي يتهمون القوة الديمقراطية في مصر بأنه لا يعمل الديمقراطية.
أنا مش فاهم.
Just a minute, Marwan, would you like to?
So the question is, what do you say to the accusation that democratic parties in Egypt have not been democratic and have advocated exclusionist policies that are not democratic? What is your response?
Please do, and then we'll come to you, then we'll finish. Yeah, please.
No, I agree that the terminology of democratic forces is very troubling because the majority of democratic forces in the last 7 months proved to be more secular or statist than democratic. Farid is right to say that the campaign to sell the constitution failed with the youth, with young people, and that this has led to fear among the ruling, including the old forces. But what Farid does not mention is that this also reflects the failure of your own party, because your party, first of all, has a prime minister from the party, but also participated in the drafting process. The higher governing body of the party called for a yes vote, and young people refused to come out. So it is the failure to convince the youth to come out is a failure of the state and its propaganda, but also a failure of all the parties that called on people to come out and vote yes. Of course, the discussion did not include any reference to the massacres and the killings and the worst massacres in recent histories that were authorized by, again, a cabinet of a prime minister that comes from your party. And I appreciate that the Social Democratic Party issued several public statements condemning human rights violations by this regime and condemning the use of force against peaceful protests. And I appreciate that the prime minister suspended his membership in the party when he assumed the cabinet. But I think the very fact, so to come to the question, do you think the belonging of your party to the coalition of June 30th or July 3rd is going to cost your party in the next election? People now are making parallels with the Wafd party and the Tajammu party before the 25th of January. Many people feel that your party and others from the National Salvation Front have become the palace opposition. Parties that are opposition but are part of the governing coalition. How do you think this will impact your performance in the next elections?
مترجم ولا؟
ده مفهوم.
مفهوم. Okay.
We need to. Yeah, we really need to finish. But do you have just a short comment?
Yeah, a short one. Actually, we are all asking the same question. What kind of animal is this movement? The way I see it, a political movement is an expression of a bloc in society that has economic interests, that is engaged in social negotiation with other blocs in society. How have you turned your idealistic movement into a real negotiator? إلى مفاوض اجتماعي، إلى لاعب أساسي في التفاوض الاجتماعي على المصالح الاقتصادية والعمل.
Yeah, you're saying who is the core constituency that the party seeks to represent and actively represents within a larger polity. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Just why don't you make a general response to these various points? Yeah. Steve,
sorry, Steve. Yeah, we did not.
Yeah.
ستيف بيقول إنه يعني في تناقض بين الطرح اللي قدمته أنت. في مرة بتقول إنه الديمقراطيك فورسز يعني ما كانش عندها أو لم تنجح في تقديم رؤية معينة، وفي مرة تانية بتقول إنه لا، في قبول يعني من طبقة كبيرة لهاي الديمقراطيك فورسز. مرة بتقول إنه ما لسه للآن يعني لم تنجح في تقديم حلول، بس ما فيش حدا تاني ناجح في تقديم حلول. يعني كل المشهد السياسي مشهد ضعيف إلى الآن في مصر. في تناقض بين الطرحين.
طيب خلينا أقول
رايت ستيف.
خلينا أقول الأول إنه القوى الديمقراطية مش إقصائية، بالعكس. لو عايزين نتكلم على أبرز ما يميز القوى الديمقراطية هي أنها القوى الوحيدة القادرة على إدارة التعايش، لأنه قوى الدولة القديمة كانت إقصائية بامتياز، أقصت جميع الأطراف ما عدا الإخوان، كانت بتعقد معهم صفقات من حين لآخر. ده قبل 25 يناير. بعد 25 يناير محاولة الإخوان للانفراد بالحكم كانت محاولة إقصائية. أنا أعتقد إنه القوى الديمقراطية تستطيع إدارة التعايش، وإحنا حاولنا ده في الفترة الأخيرة. يعني المبادرة اللي قدمها زياد بهاء وهو يعني معانا في الحزب اللي أطلق عليها تفعيل المسار الديمقراطي، كانت محاولة لبناء مجال سياسي يتسع حتى للقوى الإسلامي السياسي، وإحنا كحزب تصرفنا بناء على المبادرة دي وقمعت المبادرة وقمع الحزب في التصرف في هذا الاتجاه. ده موضوع تاني، بس احنا كنا نتصرف على هذا الأساس. لكن نحن لا ننفرد بالحكم الآن، لا ننفرد بإدارة شؤون البلاد بحيث نقدر ندير هذا التعايش، لكن احنا مش قوة إقصائية بالتأكيد. اتنين، في السؤال حوالين التناقض في كلامي بين عندنا رؤية ولا ما عندناش رؤية، موجودين على الأرض ولا مش موجودين على الأرض، كلها مسائل نسبية. يعني أنا بقول إنه القوى الديمقراطية من الممكن أن تدير شؤون مصر في ظرف من 5 سنوات من الآن. ممكن للقوى الديمقراطية لتحالف ديمقراطي أن يدير البلاد، وأعتقد أن ده الحل الوحيد الممكن لإنقاذ مصر من الأزمة الراهنة. عودة الإخوان أمر صعب جدا، وعودة القوى القديمة أمر يكاد يكون مستحيل. القوى الديمقراطية مؤهلة ومرشحة، فأنا أنسب التحدي إلى هذا الهدف. يعني احنا في حاجة إلى مزيد من الوجود على الأرض، في حاجة إلى مزيد من وضوح الرؤية السياسية والاجتماعية، في حاجة إلى المزيد من، لكن في اوريدي وضع على الأرض موجود. يعني مش معنى ان انا بقول ان ملناش خطاب اجتماعي كافي ان ملناش خطاب اجتماعي، وفي خطاب اجتماعي للقوى الديمقراطيه، لكن في رايي غير كافي. في حاجه الى جهد. دي التحديات اللي مطروحه. لما بقول ان احنا ما عندنا وجود على الارض، بس الخبرات التنظيميه والسياسيه اللي عندنا محدوده، ده لان انا لازم ابقى قد الوضع الحالي ده 5 مرات. يعني لو انا النهارده حزب فيه 20-30 الف، انا المفروض ابقى 150 الف في البحر 5 سنين عشان اقدر ادير بلد زي مصر. فده تحدي كبير مطروح علينا. فهي المشكلة انه اذا كنا بنفكر في الحكم والسلطة، فلازم نبقى فاهمين ان دي مشاكل كبيرة عندنا، مش مشاكل بقى الفلوس والبناء التنظيمي بالمعنى التقليدي، لا، في مشكلات كبيرة تتعلق ببناء احزاب كبيرة. واحنا يعني انا اعتقد ان المصري الديمقراطي الاجتماعي والوفد وربما المصريين الاحرار دي الاحزاب اللي ممكن تلعب دور في الفترة الجاية. ومعروف ان في خلال ايام هيعلن تحالف انتخابي بين ال3 احزاب دول. يعني انا من اسبوعين تقريبا احنا قاريين فاتحه، ومفروض ان احنا يعني في ظرف ايام هيعلن رسميا عن تحالف انتخابي بين ال3 احزاب دول. وهذا التحالف
Okay. Farid does not agree that democratic forces are exclusionist. He thinks they are the only force that is able to basically supervise a national reconciliation process, if you want. Neither the old guard nor the Ikhwan can do this. Both have behaved in an exclusionist manner, and therefore the only force that can basically supervise such a process of inclusion are these democratic forces. He does not see also the contradiction that Steve talks about. These are relative issues. He sees a real possibility of these democratic forces being able to govern Egypt in 5 years, but they still need to develop their social program, which is still lacking, and they need to develop their mobilization and organizational abilities, and he sees that as the main a challenge. He also said that in a few days or a week or three social democratic forces, الوفد
3 سوشيال يعني
اوكي فيهم ليبرال، ما صحيح، الوفد المصريين الأحرار and the Free Egyptians, the وفد and the Social Democratic Party of Mr. Zahran will announce a coalition to run together for the next elections.
اخر التعليق بقى دقيقة واحدة على كلام حسام بس. احنا حزب كبير هنمتص يعني التوترات الخاصة بالاستفتاء. احنا قبل كده امتصينا التوتر الخاص بانتخابات رئاسة الجمهورية، كان هذا امر صعب جدا جدا، كنا في خيارات صعبة. يعني الاستفتاء، الأجنحة الشبابية في الحزب عندنا بعضها ما راحش الاستفتاء أنا عارف، وبعضها قال لا احنا في التصويت في الهيئة العليا احنا مش حزب صغير، احنا في الهيئة العليا حضر 200 واحد، 25% صوتوا بلا للدستور في اقتراع سري. لأول مرة نلجأ لاقتراع سري منعا للحرج. يعني ما عملناش التصويت رفعا بالأيدي، عملنا صناديق تصويت سري بالبطاقات، واللي جاش عمل توكيلات، ف25% قالوا لا. وعبر النقاش كان في 2 من لا 2 من نعم، وبعدين 25% قالوا لا. احنا حزب في 25% قالوا لا، احنا حزب في أجنحة شبابية رفضت تروح للاستفتاء، واحنا نتيجة إدراكنا العميق لأن احنا حزب كبير وفي أجنحة وطيارات وغير متماسك بقوة، لازال لم يتماسك بعد بقوة، فبنترك كقيادة هذه الأمور يعني إلى حد ما لوز علشان الحزب يستمر، وإن احنا نخوض جولة عقد جولة وننجح. يعني وأنا ردي على حسام إن احنا هننجو من هذه الأزمة. في أزمة، أنا عارف إن في أزمة، والأزمة الكبيرة انتخابات الرئاسة والموقف من السيسي لو ترشح هتبقى أزمة مروعة يعني. بس أعتقد إن احنا نقدر ننجو من هذه الأزمة ويظل الحزب متماسك بإذن الله.
So we are a big party that is able to absorb these upheavals, particularly when it comes to the referendum. It is true that some of our youth members did not, participate in the referendum. It is also true that in a secret ballot that we conducted, 25% of our members said no to the Constitution. So we chose to leave some things loose, particularly when it came to the position regarding Sisi, because a clearer position would have cost us a lot at this point in time, and we would rather keep them loose until we are able to basically stand on more solid ground.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you both, Farid and Marwan, for your comments and going into depth in this difficult question. It's 2:30. Marwan, I turn it back over to you, and I think Fred.
Yes, abadan bilaks. Thank you so much, Tom and Farid. We now move to the last but very important session, in my view, of the rising sectarianism and the regional outlook. It's a session that will be moderated by Fred and will include Emil Hkayem and Fanar Haddad and Steve Heidemann. Let me clear this so you have. 3:30. Yeah, I guess 3:15 maybe. 3:15. It's 2:30.
2:30. Okay.
45 minutes.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to moderate this last panel with the somewhat depressing title of sectarianism and the regional outlook. Although I'm determined to extract some optimism from this during the course of these deliberations. Obviously, if we're following this region, sectarianism is all the rage again. The region, at first glance, appears to be pulling itself apart at the seams along Sunni Shia lines. In many instances, I think sectarianism is the antithesis of pluralism. This region, of course, contains many different diverse identities. They've coexisted. They've been subsumed at times. How and why do they become politicized, toxic, and malignant? Obviously, state failure and state weakness, I think, is the principal culprit. Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. But authoritarians have also nourished and, I think, instrumentalized sectarianism for a variety of reasons as a ruling strategy to divide the opposition and to dissuade demands for greater pluralism and democracy. This idea that the region is naturally and intrinsically divided and these people need a strong man to rule over them. We can also look at the role of outside meddling. The region's rival heavyweights, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have done much to raise the sectarian temperature in this region. But a note of caution is in order. I think the sectarian lens is often a very convenient shorthand for making sense of a very complex and multidimensional set of challenges in this region. So I've asked our speakers to sort of peel back the layer of religious differences, this notion of these primordial hatreds in the region, and really look at the underlying roots in terms of political actors, in terms of institutions, in terms of policies, economic disparities, exclusionary institutions, across a variety of sectors, labor, security, also looking at the role of media. I think we can also chart the rise of sectarianism to the explosion of social media in the region. The question moving forward ahead is, what are the sorts of institutions and politics that need to emerge in the region that can recognize and respect the diversity of this region and diminish this argument that we hear, this authoritarian argument, that a strong arm is needed to keep these fractious identities in check. I'm delighted to really welcome world-class expertise on this panel. To my right, Fanar Haddad joins us all the way from Singapore. He's a fellow at the Middle East Institute there. His focus is on Iraq and sectarianism. He's the author of a book, Sectarianism in Iraq, Antagonistic Visions of Unity. To my immediate left, Emil Hokeim, a fellow at IISS, also a specialist on Syria, the author of a seminal book, Syria's Uprising and the Fracturing of the Levant. And he's joined by Steve Heidemann, a specialist at USIP, again, an expert on Syria who wrote a seminal paper on authoritarian adaptation in the region. He's also done work on Bahrain as well. Fanar, since you traveled the farthest, you get the first question. Looking at Iraq, I think in many ways the Iraq War's legacy has been a profoundly sectarian one. This idea that the Iraq War, the invasion, opened this Pandora's box, the 2006 eruption of sectarian strife with the Samarra bombing. We can go back even further to the elections, the way the elections were construed. Some people argue that the American occupation was responsible. I want to ask you to give us your thoughts on the legacy of the Iraq War on the region, but then also moving forward into Iraq's trajectory today and how it impacts the region's sectarian climate.
Okay, so the legacy of the Iraq War, well, I mean, I think it's beyond debate about the Pandora's box and what have you. But what does that entail? So the way I see it is that Iraq 2003 was a bit of a Copernican moment in sectarian relations in the Arab world, and that for the first time the Arab world was violently forced to confront a new reality, one in which the world did not revolve around Arab Sunnis, which is why it's only in the last 11 years that you have this activation of an Arab Sunni identity. I mean, prior to that, it was something so taken for granted, in need of no validation or expression. It just wasn't there. It's as a result of Iraq and in response to what is perceived as a threat of this rising Shia crescent, or call it what you want. Now, in defense of that rather paranoid view, the Iraqi politicians that were eventually empowered, or at least significant proportions of them, were not just, I mean, as I always stress, they're not just politicians who happen to be Shia. No, they were very much sort of Shia politicians in the sense that their Shia identity informed their political outlook and their political programs. And you see this decades prior to 2003 in the sense that throughout their careers, their very long careers, there were always minority advocate groups, whether it's on ethnic lines or on sectarian lines. And that's perfectly legitimate. However, when it came to national politics, it just didn't translate well to national politics, nor were they able to reinvent themselves as national politicians. They came to national politics still with the sort of sectional advocacy mindset. Now, the Sunni-Shia divide is immensely complicated by the fact of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I often wonder what it would have been like were the Islamic Republic of Iran not in the equation. That is probably the main thing that differentiates the Sunni-Shia divide from perhaps other sectarian divides in the region. The backlash against sort of 2003, well, before that, let me say, this sort of Copernican moment that I mentioned, it ties in well with the subtitle of your book, Marwan, The Battle for Pluralism. I think, for me anyway, it really illustrates sort of the difficulty that places like Iraq are having with the concept of pluralism, whether it's the newly empowered forces or the previously entrenched, sort of the backlash against that. In both cases, hence, you have this sort of zero-sum political game. The sectarian element, obviously, is intrinsic to, it's structural to the Iraqi political system. I don't think identity politics are an anomaly in Iraqi politics. I think the system is based on identity politics, and I think that is obvious. The ripple effect on the region, I suppose something needs to be said about that. It's increasingly difficult to talk about sectarian dynamics in Iraq and sectarian dynamics in the region as if they're two separate things. What started in Iraq has very much sort of been echoed around the region, and the salience of sectarian identity throughout particularly in the Mashriq, is something truly unprecedented. The Arab awakenings, you could argue, have accelerated that. I mean, beginning in 2003, sort of that's when the new sectarian framework was emerging. Obviously, after the Arab awakenings, you have a new framework, well, a whole new political Middle East sort of emerging. In both cases, I think what we're seeing is sort of the collapse of long-established institutions, deep structures of social control, both formal and informal. The collapse of these that had effectively but detrimentally suppressed much of what we're seeing today being played out. Divisive forces that had been kept locked away safely in the national closet, and now they're being sort of working themselves out without restraint. So with the Arab awakening, I think Syria more than anywhere else, but Bahrain as well, shows us what you mentioned about the instrumentalization of sectarian identity. What I'd add to what you said is that we've seen that not just as a regime maintenance mechanism, we've also seen that as an anti-regime mobilizational tool. So it's very much something that's being driven from both above and from below, something that is being used by reactionary and by revolutionary forces. And for me, that ties into, again, what you mentioned about new media. I think the emergence of new media, which coincided with the Iraq War, of course, sort of opened new forms of expression, new avenues of mobilization that have basically empowered many people in a completely unprecedented way, sort of the decentralization of the flows of information, and have given rise to these forces, some of which are profoundly sectarian. For example, to give a simple example, there's much talk about sort of the Salafization of mainstream Sunni Islam. This is something that has been facilitated by new media, by private satellite networks, and you have sort of the erosion of national boundaries when it comes to the sectarian issues. So one thing I'm very interested in is how Iraqi sectarian dynamics have influenced sectarian dynamics in the region, and conversely the same, how sectarian dynamics as they usually play out outside Iraq have influenced Iraqi sectarian dynamics. And I suppose you wanted something on Iraq's trajectory. Well, you wanted some optimism. I can't give you optimism, that's for sure. Right now we're in election season in Iraq, and as seems to be the case with every single round of elections, you have heightened sectarian entrenchment and a spike in violence, of course. And again, it comes down to the way the system is structured, I think. There's far too many political actors whose political fortunes depend on sectarian entrenchment. The idea of reaching out to a cross-sectarian constituency is a non-starter. Hence, come election time, it actually serves your interest to have some kind of a crisis. And the crisis today is very obviously contrived in that there was no pressing need for the Iraqi government to close the protest camps in Anbar or to arrest the MP Ahmed al-Alwani, let alone kill his brother al-Alwani. But that's the nature of the system. How long this can be sustained, I don't know. And for all we know, this current crisis might be a crisis too far.
Great. Okay. Emil, can you offer your thoughts on Syria? Sort of the same dynamics, the way they're playing out in Syria, the sort of sectarianization of the war, its ripple effects, the role of external actors.
Sure. And thanks for the invitation. And congratulations, Marwan, on the book. Congratulations on the book as well, which is very relevant to what we do, the Gulf, Fred. Before answering precisely those questions, I think it's important to highlight assumptions that are often made about sectarianism and how they impact the political debate. I mean, one of the, and this is certainly relevant to Syria, there was an assumption in the heads of many people that somehow secularism is the antithesis of sectarianism. Just 3 years ago in this room, in Marwan's presence, then Senator John Kerry gave a talk on Syria. And that was just a day or two after the first demonstrations in Syria. And he made the point that don't worry about Assad. He knows what he's doing. He's a secular guy. He has the vision, etc. And it was always shocking for me to see Assad described as secular, because being a lifestyle secular doesn't mean being espousing the values of secularism. And it's also not. You can be a sectarian secular in the Levant. You can have the two identities at the same time. It's not antithetical. It's not mutually exclusive. So sectarianism is certainly not the antithesis of secularism. The second issue is that when we define a regime like the Assad regime as being sectarian, i.e. Alawite regime, it leads some people to make a very simplistic statement about what it means practically. I mean, one of the big assumptions, for instance, is that the Alawite community benefited disproportionately from 40 years of Assad, 4 decades of Assad rule, as if somehow the fortunes of the community had been lifted above those of other communities inside Syria, including the Sunnis. This is not borne by the research, by the data that is available, for a very simple reason. When you are a minority leader who is relying on a certain segment of your population for support, for muscle, etc., you need to keep these people on their toes. You need to keep them afraid, angry. If you lift them to the middle class, if you really empower them, if you really educate them, provide them with health care and so on, they may not be willing to actually sacrifice to fight for the survival of your own regime. And in fact, many Alawis have precisely been kept in a state of relative poverty to make sure that they were easily mobilized. So, there is always this notion that because it was an Alawite regime, somehow Alawites did much better than everyone else. They accumulated wealth in disproportional ways and so on. So this is to really get to the point that if we want to understand these regimes' strategies of survival, of exclusion, of mobilization, etc., asabiya, group solidarity, kinship, is a much better concept to use than sectarianism. Okay, where was Syria just before the uprising? And was there any kind of sectarism? There was. There was a sectarianism, but it was denied by most Syrians. They looked at their immediate neighborhood, Lebanon and then later Iraq, and Syrians were in denial that somehow they had in them the ingredients that would lead to such societal fragmentation, that there were other identities, that there were sub- or supranational that they could ascribe to. And in a way, that was a success of the Assad regime to, create this perception that Syria was somehow different, that those other loyalties had been subdued over time because of the success of the state, etc. And in reality, but it's not a sectarianism that was well understood by those who lived it or who had it in themselves. It was assumed, it existed there, but largely because this was largely an apolitical society. Syrians, contrary to Bahrainis, for example, didn't have 4 or 5 decades of political mobilization and other forms. So they felt it, but they didn't know how to express it. And certainly the state wouldn't allow them to express this. There were other dimensions as well before. First, it's the impact of Iraq and Lebanon on the thinking of many Syrians who started seeing the region as sectarian and then started subscribing to this idea that either an alliance of minorities inside Syria or an alliance of minorities with middle class and upper class Sunnis was the best way to deal with the backward forces and elements of the population. It's not strict sectarianism, but there is this notion of an alliance of minority that started building up, after the Iraq War. The other issue is also the ideological choices of the Assad regime around then. The deepening of the relationship with Iran happened at that time, and there were a lot of accusations from Sunni elements that Assad was giving up too much to this alliance. And one way to balance this was to open the field for Sunni religious organization to operate inside Syria. And those networks developed over time, and Assad thought he could keep these on a short leash. And Steve knows quite a lot about this. He edited a volume that explored those issues. Now, the uprising starts, and it's very tempting to look at the uprising and say it was primarily sectarian and Islamist in its nature. In fact, when one look at the political geography of the uprising, it's not this thesis is not well supported. And in fact, the way it spread, the regions in which it spread at first, were not necessarily the more Islamist ones. I mean, Daraa and Idlib were traditionally bastions of the Ba'ath Party and the military. So it points to other factors at play rather than pure sectarianism. But it's difficult to deny that over time, the viciousness of the fight, the need to develop a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, the requirement of communal self-defense, etc., have led to a real sectarization of the crisis. Now, it's interesting to look at how different communities have behaved, not just look at the Sunni majority. The Ismailis, for instance, are largely, who technically are Shias, tend to be pro-uprising rather than against uprising for, the way the Ismaili community saw its own disenfranchisement inside Syria. Two of the main officers that led the coups, the Ba'athist coups in the 60s, were Ismailis, and they were put aside by Salah Jadid and Hafiz al-Assad. So the rest of the community felt cheated by this. The Druze have, however, chosen to be totally on the sideline, even though one of the main military commanders of the Assad regime, Assam Zahaddin, is a Druze, and he's very much in the media and popular. The community doesn't want to be associated with the repression and so on, trying to be on the side. The Christian community is apolitical. It hasn't chosen as a community a stand, although the main figures of the community are largely with Assad. Now, when it comes to the Sunni community, the real player there, we also see a lot of divergences. The upper class and the upper middle class in the Sunni community, I would argue, are either fence-sitters or squarely on the side of the regime. That's not primarily because of a sectarian reading of what's happening in Syria. They see all these other forces as the revolutionary forces as rural, backwards in their economic thinking, in terms of lifestyle choices, etc. And they basically are trying to protect their lifestyle, their vested interests, and so on. The revolutionary forces are also divided. Syria is not a homogeneous country in terms of territorial division. I mean, it's a very communities live with each other. It's not as clear-cut as Iraq, for instance, was even in 2003. This basically means that depending on where you are in the country, you tend to be more or less exposed to radical Islam ideas, etc., and you behave very differently. There are many places in Syria where local Sunni communities have actually protected other minorities, etc., because of a long tradition of coexistence and so on. In other places, especially Idlib and northeast Syria, this is no longer the case. The local communities have been really radicalized. This has also been influenced by the impact of external actors on the Syrian scene, and especially the Gulf, I would say Gulf non-state actors, and Fred wrote about this as well. A lot of the radicalization in Syria is fueled, financed by local, by Kuwaiti, Bahraini, Saudi actors who basically think that if the Sunnis lost Iraq, they can still win in Syria, and somehow that rectifies the balance. So an enormous amount of money has been poured into this, and sometimes to really tragic outcomes. One of the first massacres against Shias in Iraq was almost ordered by Kuwaiti financiers. It was back in June 2013, a village just outside Deir ez-Zor. That's one of the first large-scale massacre committed by Syrian rebels against Shias, and in that case they were Shias, not Alawite. Later, the big battle for Latakia of this summer, July, August as well, was largely financed by Gulf financiers, and it was almost in order by in this regard. So it's important to understand the role of external actor in fueling this. When it comes to the Assad regime, and I'll end on this, the Assad regime has the luxury of having what I call a segmented communication strategy. It can tell different community different things. So when it talks to the remaining Sunni its remaining Sunni constituency, it emphasizes that the Assad regime represents the state. It's the only element inside Syria that can keep Syria unified as a country, etc. At the same time, it uses other channels to propagate a sectarian message. It doesn't necessarily do it directly. Sometimes it does it through Shia militias, Hezbollah, Iraqi militias that are involved inside Syria. But it can play on both, on the narrative of a strong, typical Arab state and on the sectarian dimension. Let me end here.
Great. Okay. Steve, to close up, a two-part question. First, what's your assessment of sort of the best case outcome in Syria? And then, more importantly, I think putting on your conflict resolution policy hat, how do we get out of this sectarian dilemma? What are the institutions needed to mitigate sectarianism? Fanar mentioned that this authoritarian argument of keeping these identities in the quote national closet. How do we come out of that? Right. What are the sort of processes and institutions needed to avoid that repressive impulse, but then also ensure we don't go down this path of inflaming sectarianism?
Right. Well, thank you, Fred, and thanks to my fellow panelists and to Marwan as well for putting this event together. It's been very interesting. In terms of a best case scenario, we look under a microscope for best case scenarios in Syria. But I can see two pathways out of conflict, both of which I think are plausible, although both will take a significant amount of work to achieve. The first is an incremental strategy in which both the regime and the opposition, clearly under significant pressure from relevant external actors, begin a process of establishing small local level understandings that mitigate conflict with very specific goals in mind in specific areas. Delivery of humanitarian relief, ending of blockades, creating contexts in which it becomes possible to exclude some of the most extremist groups, and that these kinds of small-scale understandings create an environment in which we can imagine broader shifts in the conflict dynamics that could be exploited to move diplomatic processes at a higher level around bigger questions of an agreement that would bring the conflict to an end. That too might need to be incremental in the sense of initially establishing broader ceasefires, in the sense of introducing perhaps, although this is quite an implausible option from the perspective of international players, but introducing some kind of peacekeeping or peace maintenance force that would respond to some of the security concerns of communities who feel themselves endangered, including significant components of the Alawite community. So this sort of incremental strategy, I think, offers one pathway out of this conflict. Another, which would actually, I think, push in a very different direction, would be to see those groups which back the opposition adopt a more significant and more significantly constructive role in creating conditions on the ground that would facilitate meaningful negotiations around a political transition of the kind that I think we are not likely to see at the upcoming Geneva II negotiations. I think there's been pretty broad recognition of a significant disconnect between the expectations about what the elements of a settlement need to look like at Geneva and the conditions on the ground and the sorts of incentives and constraints those impose on both the regime and the opposition. And if we were to try to narrow some of those gaps, I think the way forward in that regard is to begin to deal with this asymmetry in levels of support between the external backers of the Assad regime and the external backers of the opposition. Now, what that means, not to be opaque, is providing support to vetted elements of the armed opposition that would permit them to change the psychology of the regime in ways that might induce it to move toward a more meaningful process of negotiation. That is a very long shot. I don't think we should underestimate the difficulty there. 2.5 years ago, it posed a far less daunting challenge. Now it's significant, but we do have some basis for believing that kind of shift in strategy is not entirely far-fetched, and the most important of them, which is one Emil and I have talked about, is that if the U.S. really has, and others have really shifted the focus of their concerns around Syria to the spread of extremist groups and terrorism, we really only have one actor in the conflict right now, which is engaged in counterterrorism, and that is the armed opposition, in particular the Jabhat al-Islamiyya, the Islamic Front, which the U.S. has reached out to, has tried to make contact with, has had conversations with. And while that in no way means that there's any shift at the level of the political leadership in the United States about a willingness to take the next several steps and extend support, I think this opening up of an opportunity to support active counterterrorism on the ground is one that I hope would begin to become a subject of much more serious political debate. And of those two pathways, and if that were to happen, then I think, again, that could cascade into some spillover effects on broader conflict dynamics in ways that might create conditions in which more productive negotiations could be held. Now, of those two pathways, I have to express a preference for the first. I think I'd rather see micro-level politics from below that produce understandings on the ground become a platform for more wide-ranging discussions among a broader set of actors about how to take advantage of those to change conflict dynamics more broadly. But either one of those pathways, I think, is going to be very long and very difficult to reach. But you asked about a best case, and so I won't hedge my best cases too heavily. In terms of the question about where we go from here, how do we find a pathway out of some of these broader issues of sectarian polarization that we've been discussing? I'll be brief about this, and again somewhat schematic. Both Fanar and Emil were very nuanced, I think, in very useful ways about sectarian dynamics, and I would hope we all take their I think very textured conversations about sectarian dynamics very much into heart, because we often tend to treat sectarianism as a monolithic phenomenon and as a phenomenon that is expressed in the same ways today as it was a generation ago, and neither of those are true. However, having said that, we are clearly moving through a moment of quite intense sectarian polarization. We're moving through a moment in which already quite weak conceptions of citizenship, I think, have been placed under enormous strain. And the leading response to these pressures on the part of those who feel most threatened by sectarian extremism has been to turn to these authoritarian regimes as a bulwark against what they view as the threat of sectarian extremism. And so this has led to this reassertion of authoritarian governance which is an extraordinarily distressing trend following this period in which mass politics emerged for the first time in a generation, or in 50 years in the Arab world, in the hope of opening up political arenas, broadening participation, broadening inclusion. And yet, even though this has been the most recent wave of reactions to political trends in the region, I'll take something of a best case view of this question as well and suggest that this trend isn't going to last forever. That I think we have to anticipate that through one means or another, this period of both accelerating or deepening sectarian polarization and the backlash it has provoked will slow, will perhaps become vulnerable to reversals. And I think the most likely form that these reversals will take is the reconstruction of citizenship as a meaningful category for political participation in the Arab world, but of a different form than we've seen in the post-colonial period of state building. I think we'll see conceptions of citizenship that I would describe as more intensely hyphenated than we might have seen in the past, in which notions of national identity and sectarian identity become integrated in new ways, and that we move towards systems of governance which try to accommodate those more intensely hyphenated identities along lines that we haven't really seen very widely developed to date. But here's where I want to just make a couple final comments. On one hand, we've seen some attempts to reconcile these more intensely hyphenated identities through political systems of governance in the Arab world. None of them have worked very well. We have Lebanon, in which the Taif Accords, well, forgetting the pre-Taif period, but in which the Taif Accords consolidated a set of sectarian power-sharing arrangements that lay the groundwork for the political and social crisis in which Lebanon finds itself today as a spillover effect of Syria in part. We have Iraq, in which the experience of accommodating these more intensely hyphenated identities has been one of soft partition. You could bring Sudan into this conversation, hard partition, as a response to this process. And so none of these solutions have really worked. But there is a debate underway, and it was alluded to here earlier, that I think does hold out more positive possibilities, and that is this region-wide debate on federalism, and on federalism was one, and on decentralization. That debate is happening in Lebanon, it's happening in Jordan, Yemen, Iraq. Mustafa mentioned it in Morocco. To me, this is one of the strategies for achieving positive sum solutions to questions of how political power is allocated. It's one of the strategies for achieving positive sum solutions to questions of governance within societies in which these intensely hyphenated identities raise obstacles to some contrived notion of unitary identity, or governance that can be managed in a centralized fashion, as opposed to governance that emerges through a very, very informed debate about preferences at the local level, at the communal level. So I see this as an encouraging trend, and I know that it also carries with it significant challenges. This is, after all, as the Yemen National Dialogue has shown us, a debate about the distribution of power, about the allocation of political power. That's never easy. It's a debate about the allocation of resources. Never easy. But compare it to the alternative. Compare it to what would be involved in trying to reconstruct these centralized regimes anchored in one unified conception of national identity. It's like putting the genie back in the bottle with guns. I just don't see it as an extraordinarily viable strategy. So I think if I were to look at where this is headed and how we can exploit some of the debates that have emerged, I would place my bets on this conversation about positive sum strategies for managing for governance that provide for a greater degree of inclusion, participation, and decentralization of political power. And I'll stop there.
Super. That sounded like a note of optimism.
I tried. I tried.
You delivered. You delivered. Okay. In our remaining time, I'll turn it over for questions. Anyone? Yeah.
I have more of an intervention than a question, but perhaps it is a question. And I'm drawing on the situation in Yemen. Sectarianism is not an immutable situation. In the past 40 years, due to Saudi-funded proselytization, the Zaydi population has decreased from 35% to around 20% of the population of Yemen. And the rest of them have actually become Wahhabi, Sunni. And then in the past few years, because of the war on Saada and the perceived oppression of the tribal population of Saada, they have gone back to Zaydism with even greater fervor. So I think that sectarianism is something that you can handle with some kind of good governance. And it has to do with also a higher level of urbanization. Urbanization always deals with, because sectarianism as a local identity is often connected with the distribution of labor or mode of production. In Yemen, most of the Shia, Zaydi Shia, are tribal, semi-Bedouin, while the peasants are all, without exception, Sunni. I think that we have a battery of options that we can deal with the sectarian situation that will include naturally coexistence and the political process, but also, I think, some other forms of social organization.
Mm-hmm. Reactions?
I tend to agree. I just, and I think your point about the mutability of sectarianism is something that all of us on this panel share. But the question of how to accommodate societies in which these identities are mutable is an issue that existing state forms have been very, very bad in being able to address. And that's why I placed the stress I did on rethinking how political power is organized in these systems, with an emphasis on decentralization.
Yeah, you point to the role of external players in exacerbating sectarianism. You mentioned Saudi. Saudi Arabia and Iran are sectarian actors by definition. For a long time, Iran was a sectarian actor that had an ideological foreign policy. So the sectarian element was not emphasized. It was precisely not to alienate local ones, local actors in Lebanon or other places. But Hezbollah is a sectarian organization by definition. I mean, the name, the organization, the marja' al-taqlid, etc. The same thing with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has organic allies that tend to be on the extreme end of the spectrum. At the same time, the irony is that Saudi Arabia's preferred partners in many places in the Levant, at the beginning, were not sectarian actors, were not primarily sectarian actors. They tend to be more on the secular, soft community leaders like Hariri, like others in Syria as well. The preference is not necessarily to support the most extreme ones, but the most extreme ones tend to be the most reliable, the most pliable, the easiest to deploy when things are difficult. And I think the instinct of those two sectarian actors, Iran and Saudi, when things get tough, is to go and invest in these guys, because there are other interlocutors. In the case of Syria, it's thanks to Saudi Arabia that you still have a secular opposition, because they cared about Michel Kilo and Riyad al-Saif and others. But at the same time, these guys don't provide muscle. They're soft-spoken. They're nice to have around a discussion table like this. But when it comes to winning points on the ground, they're not there. So very often sectarian powers can be hostage to the sectarian instrument, sectarian partners they have on the ground. So it's a vicious circle, to be honest. And that's one of the complications of the current situation in Syria and Lebanon.
Yes. Thank you so much for your insights. In reality, we are facing an issue related to religious minorities. What we can learn from some European experiences like Kosovo in dealing with the issues mainly in Iraq, in the future of Syria, for example. Could the experience of Kosovo and other places, but mainly the experience of Kosovo, helps us in predicting a semi-democratic future for Syria, for example?
I mean, I'm sure Steve has a lot of ideas on this. Very, very briefly, I think that those two situations are so far apart, and the regional competition is such that I have a hard time deriving strong lessons. I think what helped in Kosovo and other places is that equal citizenship for all basically was a requirement for regional integration. Essentially, the outside powers told the Kosovars, you want to get richer, you want to be integrated, etc., then you have to figure out, on paper, the rights are the same for everyone. Yes, you have to negotiate, some local arrangement, a kind of, a hybrid federalism. It's not the full formula. But look at the presence on the ground. I mean, you had a large military force that went in and stabilized the country, and integration into like the wider European sphere was very conditional on progress. In the case of Syria, I don't see how you can build a regional framework, let alone send the kind of military force that is needed, and spend the time, the years, the money to get to that place. I think that Kosovo was a very easy case compared to what we're dealing in Syria.
Well, I'll just be very quick, and Fernanda, I don't know if you have anything on this. 2 points. Mustafa, I actually would be concerned about restricting this question to issues of minorities, because I think there are segments of the Sunni community as well, the majority community, and in Shia majority countries of the Shia community, who themselves would prefer to live under political systems and within societies that were more pluralistic. So I would just push back against that a little bit. With respect to Kosovo and thinking about the Balkans more broadly, and Bosnia, which for Syria at least, I think does hold some interesting lessons. One of the critical lessons is the danger of being pushed into international negotiations prematurely. I think Bosniaks in particular increasingly express regret about the consequences of Dayton. And we'll see if the coalition negotiating team has learned that lesson. And the second is the risk of radical decentralization. There are 13 parliaments in Bosnia. The joke is that if you stand on a street corner in Sarajevo and say, hello, minister, 15 people will turn around because there are so many of them. And they operate in a system in which it is ruled by unanimity, and everything is paralyzed. It's deadlocked. And so as we think about systems that accommodate very diverse societies, we have to be aware of the risks not only of contrived coherence and imposed coherence, but of radically decentralizing in ways that make coordination very, very difficult.
I suppose the Iraqi experience sort of chimes with that, not in terms of the radical decentralization, but this attempt to accommodate all ethnic and religious groups. The muhasasa, the apportionment, has been quite frankly a disaster for Iraq, in which you are faced with a situation where pretty much everyone's in the government. There is no opposition. And that, paradoxically, that increases the political relevance of sectarian identity. Whereas initially, the idea was to sort of strip it of political relevance. I think now it has reached a point where maybe the focus, I have always argued that one of the problems is exactly that sectarian identities today are accorded a disproportionate political relevance. But I'm starting to wonder, is that really the problem today? Or has it reached a point where the focus shouldn't be how do we depoliticize sectarian identities? Maybe it's reached a point where we kind of have to accept that as sort of the way it is today, because trying to depoliticize sectarian identity in the Mashriq today is a really tall order. So maybe the focus should be on how best to accommodate that. And clearly the Iraqi way of doing things has not worked, nor has the Lebanese formula either. So, future will tell.
Actually, we're dealing with this in Yemen now in our national dialogue, in that we have recognized minorities, we have provided affirmative action for them, but nothing is permanent. All affirmative action has a limited duration to deal with a specific injustice, and it ceases as soon as that a certain threshold is reached. It's easy.
Well, we always count on our young friends to show us the way forward.
Well, we'll just write it and then we'll not implement it, so then it'll be up to you to do it.
I wanted to thank the panelists for an insightful and illuminating discussion, and thank you all for attending. Marwan, did you?
Just to once again thank you all for participating under these circumstances. I truly apologize for what has happened. What we're going to try to do is to get a video portion of this edited and up online as soon as we can, hopefully in a few days' time, so that people can get to benefit from the rich discussions of today. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.